30 seconds.
In 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and into the history books as the first of only 12 men to walk on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The last Apollo started home on the 19th of December 1972, only 2.5 years after manned lunar exploration had begun. Today, much of the talent and expertise that made Apollo possible is dispersed throughout America. Most of the astronauts, too, have left. Neil Armstrong, for instance, and Buzz Aldrin, his fellow crewman on the first landing. Armstrong is now a professor of aeronautical engineering at Cincinnati University, where he retired in 1971, away from public gaze, except for a brief appearance in Chrysler commercials. Buzz Aldrin, with an engineering consultancy in Los Angeles, suffers from bouts of alcoholic depression. Pete Conrad works for McDonnell Douglas Aircraft and does advertisements for one of their subcontracting companies. Al Bean, still with NASA, training astronauts for the shuttle. Admiral Al Shepard was a millionaire while still an astronaut, now sells beer. Ed Mitchell experiments with telepathy and runs a business. Jim Irwin got religion on his flight and is now an evangelist. John Young, still with NASA, chief astronaut and commander of the first shuttle. Dave Scott is a high-technology consultant with his own business. Charlie Duke sells property in a small town in central Texas. Gene Cernan's the vice president of an oil company. And Jack Schmitt, the only geologist to fly to the moon, is now actively lobbying for space as a US senator.
The majority of them have been thinking about this for years.
These last four men, together with two other key men in Apollo, Jim Lovell, commander of the only flight that failed to get there, and ex-astronaut and administrator Jim McDivitt, got together in a Houston hotel specially for this program. And I asked them about the image NASA projected of them in the old days.
Most people will come up to you and say, gee, it's really nice to know that you're just an average guy, you know, that you put your pants on one leg at a time. Because first off, you go into a meeting or an audience and they expect you to float in your spacesuit and land on the stage. And when you, especially a young kids, and if you don't do that, it's almost boo hiss, get off the stage, you're a fake.
Don't you do that every time?
No, I've tried a couple of times.
What is this
That's
one thing that
was
projected the all-American boy image, clean cut, and I think at the time it was necessary. I mean, it showed it had a new hero worship in the country at a time when.
Weren't you that image?
Well, I faked it.
Rarely, if ever, has any group of individuals captured the public imagination more than did these men, at least up until public interest began to wane after the first landing. They were, as Jim Lovell said, portrayed as clean-living, all-American boys. But there was always a touch of the Superman about them. True? Back in December 1958, if you had wanted to be an astronaut, the announcement made it sound simple. Basic requirements, age between 25 and 40, under 5'11", it was going to be a small spacecraft. Science degree qualifications, qualified jet test pilot, healthy, experience in dangerous and stressful situations. They were thinking of people like balloonists, Arctic explorers, mountain climbers and such, but the White House was thinking of national security and said you stick to the military. But you might still have qualified. Let me go on. The selectors also said that they were looking for high intelligence, ability to command, ability to take orders, motivation, creativity, mathematical ability, sociability, adaptability, maturity, decency, psychological stability. Could you sit absolutely still in a dangerous situation? How are you doing so far? But then, candidates, and there were 508 of them, had to go through exhaustive interviews in Washington, followed by every known medical test, including sperm count, at the interestingly named Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Well, that cut them down to 31. And then it was off to secret midnight rendezvous in groups of 5 in Dayton, Ohio, for what was known as stress testing.
Now, when I look back on it, it was very idiotic. Some of the tests were still being devised as we went through. The rolling you around in all sorts of directions, anybody would get sick.
They also dropped them, spun them, heated them, tilted them, made them run on treadmills, and vibrated them until they indicated that they'd had enough. At which point they took them off to further forms of torture.
Your foot was in a bucket of ice water. There was a flash of light in your eye, very painful. You spent 10 hours in a darkened room. Some of the stuff today, we realize, was unnecessary. I think, though, that the doctors didn't know what the people would get into in space, and so they were trying to make sure that whoever they selected was immune to just about anything.
And all the time, the psychiatrists were saying things like, please give 20 answers to the question, who am I? Could you have done that? Never mind the rest.
Well, they had a very in-depth aptitude test, things that all aptitude tests have. Do you love your mother and things of this nature. The Rorschach test, do you recall those? We look at ink blots and what do you see there? Well, in our second selection of the Gemini program, Al Shepard sort of warned us about this. He said, now be sure that you give the proper answers, because make sure that you are masculine enough, otherwise you'll be eliminated from the program. And of course, he was saying this in tongue-in-cheek, but we all took him seriously. So when all the ink blots came up, we looked at them, and sure enough, we'd always see some feminine anatomy in there to make sure that we gave the proper sexual response, you know?
What none of our 7 new heroes realized was that anybody who failed any test for psychological reasons, however slight, would have been out. Well, as somebody said at the time, once you've chosen your Superman, that only leaves you about 10,000 other problems to solve. Let's take a look at some of the major ones. Not least, how do you get men to the moon? The trouble with that is, what goes up tends to come down. Armstrong is now a professor of aeronautical engineering at Cincinnati University, where he retired in 1971, away from public gaze, except for a brief appearance in Chrysler commercials. Buzz Aldrin, with an engineering consultancy in Los Angeles, suffers from bouts of alcoholic depression.
And they expect you to float in your spacesuit and land on the stage, and when you, especially a young kid. Yeah. And if you don't do that, it's almost boo-hiss, get off the stage, you're a fake.
A new hero warship in the country at a time when...
weren't you that image?
Well, I faked it. Well, I faked it.
The trouble with that is, what goes up tends to come down.